I don't see any.
Safety tip.
I don't know, Francis would know. We don't think there are. Oh, Daily Tar Heel, student newspaper. Yes, sir. All right, we're about to get started, and I'm keying in the control booth so that they'll be able to start recording. But let me go ahead and open our program today. Not with theme music, though. Theme music has to be the Air Force song if we're going to do it today. Our speaker today is Colonel Martha McSally, originally from Warwick, Rhode Island, who attended the United States Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs and went on to become a distinguished graduate of the Air Force Academy. She then earned a master's degree from Harvard's JFK School of Government up in Cambridge before entering pilot training in 1991. Now, interestingly, this was at a time when she entered pilot training when the Congress was in the process of repealing the statutory prohibitions against women flying combat missions, but the Department of Defense was trying to keep up with its policy. So Colonel McSally went into pilot training, and while she was in pilot training, the statute was repealed, but DOD, it took them a while, so she originally was assigned as a T-37 instructor pilot. T-37 is a training jet for combat pilots. But then when the Department of Defense guidance came up, she was awarded a very prestigious assignment as a combat aircraft, and that was in the A-10, the A-10 Thunderbolt II, otherwise known as the Warthog. It is a close air support aircraft. Its purpose is to destroy things on the ground like tanks and other things, and as I was telling Colonel McSally beforehand, my description of an A-10 is an airframe with a massive, powerful cannon in the front of it, and maybe she'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. In January of 1995, Colonel McSally became the first woman in the United States Air Force to fly a combat aircraft into enemy territory when she flew her first sortie. A sortie is a mission over Iraq, and she subsequently logged in excess of 100 combat flying hours. Now, this was at a time when we were going through the Northern Watch and Southern Watch in Iraq after my war in 1990-91. She later served as an A-10 instructor, and again in the category of firsts. Colonel McSally has accomplished a lot of firsts in the Air Force. She ultimately went on to be the commander of the 354th Fighter Squadron, the first woman ever to command a combat aviation unit. In that role, by the way, she led her A-10 team, her crew and pilots, on a combat deployment to Afghanistan in support of Operation Enduring Freedom from September 2005 until February 2006. She flew over 225 combat hours herself during a period of increased combat activity, and under her command, the 354th Fighter Squadron just recently, I guess, was awarded the Air Force Association's very prestigious David C. Schilling Award for the best aerospace contribution to national defense in 2005. And I will tell you, even though I'm not still wearing the Air Force uniform, that is a very, very significant award, and for Colonel McSally to head that unit is a great honor for her. You may recall that she gained national attention when she successfully challenged the military policy that applied to women stationed in Saudi Arabia, and the rule was that whenever they went off the installation, they had to wear an abaya, or they had to dress as a Saudi woman would. And she mounted an attack. She refused to see the wisdom in that. I guess that's understating it. But nonetheless, the military finally acceded and recognized that if you're in the United States Armed Forces, United States Air Force, then you should be treated as such, and an officer particularly. Colonel McSally is a command pilot with over 2,600 flight hours, including over 325 combat flying hours. She has had a stellar record in the Air Force. She was promoted what we call BTZ, or below the zone, to both major and lieutenant colonel, and it's tough to find anyone who can put two of them back to back like that. And as you can see, she's wearing the eagles of a full colonel, and she's still very, very young. So she is now a student at the Air War College, which is a very select school at Maxwell Air Force Base for Air Force leaders who are going on to do bigger and better things. I will tell you, it's personally a delight for me to be able to introduce her, but it's a wonderful honor and privilege for us at Duke Law School to have Colonel McSally here to talk to us today. So, Colonel.
Okay, well, thanks for coming today and spending a little time over lunch. You guys got some tasty burritos there, I think, so you can enjoy yourselves while we're talking. It is really an honor to be in this group of prestigious students and faculty and staff of Duke University. And I hope to spend a little bit of time today talking to you about something just in general, the history of women serving in uniform, my observations as a colonel, who has commanded an aviation unit in combat, sort of where we came from, where we are, and where I think we need to go, okay? I'm going to give you candid comments. I tend to be known for being candid. I hope I don't offend anyone. I'm going to talk about real issues from my personal opinion. I'll give you the disclaimer up front that my views are not necessarily the views of the Department of Defense or the United States Air Force, although I have been approved to come here to talk about them. And they're based primarily on research that I've done and wearing the uniform now as an officer for almost 19 years. So we will have time for Q&A afterwards, so take notes and be ready to take shots at my thoughts and my logic when we're done. And I look forward to having an engaging conversation with you guys. What I want to do is run through very quickly the history, for everybody's sake, of women serving in the military in U.S. history, just to sort of get us to, we can't talk about our current context and possible policy recommendations, law recommendations, unless, we're all up to speed as far as how we got here, okay? It's my personal view that the history of women serving in uniform have been a combination of our culture at the time and women's roles in our society, and also a reflection of our necessity of needing to use all of our assets in order to be able to fight the war that we're in. Okay, so from the very beginning, the Revolutionary War, we had women that were serving. A lot of them were in support roles. They were used, as cooks and nurses and water bearers and also spies. There's a couple women who are well known from their service in the Revolutionary War. One of them was Margaret Corbin. Margaret was alongside her husband when he was manning his artillery, and her husband was wounded, and so she just took over the artillery and started firing at the enemy and killing the bad guys. So that was, I think, the first record of a U.S. woman in combat there. It was just out of necessity. She stepped up to the task. And she was later the first woman to be awarded a pension in the United States, which is interesting for her service. Deborah Sampson was the other well-known woman who served, but she disguised herself as a man. She served for several years in many battles in ground combat and eventually got wounded and was only discovered to have been a woman when she went for medical care, which is, I'm not sure how she pulled all that off for so long, but anyway, it's an interesting observation. So as soon as they realized when the doctor went to treat her that, she wasn't the gender that they thought she was, they quietly discharged her and sent her on her way. In the Civil War, again, many women fought by disguising themselves. And again, were used in a lot of sort of traditional support roles, as well as spies and saboteurs. The most famous woman serving in the Civil War was a woman named Dr. Mary Walker. And to this day, Dr. Walker is the only woman in U.S. history to have been awarded the highest honor of the Medal of Honor. So it's a pretty significant award to her. As combat medal in combat. She served under grueling conditions as a medical doctor and was captured as a POW and spent the remainder of the war as a POW. Spanish-American War, moving on to that, the government was struggling with typhoid and a number of the troops that were getting sick, and so they contracted 1,500 nurses to serve and to support, medically. They weren't in the uniform, but they were certainly a part of the effort. We joke in the military because we're doing a lot of outsourcing to contractors right now, so that was our first attempt at outsourcing, where we contracted out for these guys for medical care, and so 1,500 of them served, and 20 of them died, mostly from typhoid themselves. but 20 of them did die. In World War I, we had 23,000 nurses. We then realized, okay, especially in the area of medical care, we needed to be able to use all of our capabilities and what the nation had to bring to be able to support the fight. 23,000 nurses served at home and abroad. And we also, for the first time, actually enlisted women in other roles, admin roles, clerks, telephone operators, and lots of different roles, both at home and overseas, because again, we were very much mobilized, and we needed to make sure we were, bringing everything we had to bear on the enemy. And so women expanded into serving in other roles for the first time, wearing the uniform. Many Army nurses were actually decorated. 3 of them notably received the Distinguished Service Medal in World War I, which is the second combat medal to the Medal of Honor. For their combat medal, not just a service medal for doing great things, but a combat medal during that time. After the war, pretty much we demobilized and all the nurses were discharged, and we actually had laws passed at that time that were an impediment for women to be able to serve again. Now we ramp up though to World War II. World War II is unprecedented for our nation. I mean, our nation was mobilized to fight World War II. The greatest generation. And so women were enlisted into all the services in an unprecedented capacity. I mean, on the flying side, we had women that were flying every aircraft in the inventory. They were trained as women Air Force service pilots. These young women were just, volunteers, went through the training, and they were ferrying aircraft all over the place to and from the theater. They were instructor pilots, and they were also, this is an interesting, dangerous job, they were towing targets for the guys that were learning how to be, gunners on the ground. These guys would be up towing the targets as these guys are trying to figure out how to aim and hit the targets, and learn how to be gunners from the ground. So we actually had some women who died in service, all kidding aside, because that was a very dangerous thing as they're trying to train those guys on the ground. So women served in all capacities. I mean, unprecedented, really, in the air. Coast Guard as well. Army, Navy, I mean, you name it, 400,000 women total served in uniform during World War II, which was just incredible. As an example, 500 gave their lives, lost their lives during that time frame. As an example of, we'll start to see the whole, how do you draw the line between combat and non-combat? Because women were just in non-combat roles, they were in support roles, and that's what we were comfortable with as a country. Which was different, by the way, in some of the other countries in World War II. But in the Battle of Anzio, the hospital tents were bombed and strafed, against the international law. But the hospital tents were bombed and strafed, and 6 nurses died, and 4 of them were awarded the Silver Star for their courage under fire in the Battle of Anzio. So again, these are untold stories of people serving in the generation before us. And just amazing. There's many stories out there, and of course I've tried to hunt down some of them, but that's just an example of how women served. As a contrast, in World War II, the Russians, actually in World War I, the Russians had women, no kidding, on the front lines in ground combat. World War II, the Russians were having, again, national necessity. The women were serving in all sorts of capacities in ground combat and air combat. They actually had 3 separate fighter squadrons of women in Russia that were the first women fighter pilots. I mean, when we first transitioned into fighters in America, we thought, wow, that's amazing. It's the first time in history. And it's like, no, actually it wasn't. The Russians had us beat by several decades. I mean, they had an incredible combat record and lots of combat kills, mostly in air-to-air fighting, and also on the ground. So just another example. We struggled, and you'll see this theme through here, we really struggled with what are the limits of our culture and our necessity, and trying to figure out how we're going to maximize bringing men and women to serve in World War II. So as an example, they did an experiment. The Brits started using women in manning the AAA. AAA is the ground guns that are shooting at the aircraft. Okay, so the Brits actually started using women in their AAA crews out of necessity. I mean, this was no kidding, defend the homeland. But interestingly enough, even for the Brits, they would say, it's okay for women to do this, but they can't be the one that pulls the trigger. So they would be in the crew, they would be the ones that would loading the shells, doing everything else out there, and then they had to step aside, and the man had to pull the trigger because it was just in their culture. That's the only way they could sort of accept that. Okay, we're using our women, but we just don't want to go there. Women don't shoot, they support, kind of deal. And so we went through our own experiment in America where we tried to train up some women as an experiment in manning the AAA, and the results were incredible. I mean, they said, wow, these women's crews are incredibly more efficient than some of the male crews we have that are serving in the United States, and they put up a proposal, let's have the women start manning the AAA. And so even though they had proved the capacity, politically, it just didn't fly. It's just like, no, we're not that desperate yet. Let's wait till straits get a little bit more dire, because politically it was just going to be unacceptable to Congress, they thought, because there was a big political battle trying to even authorize women to be serving in all these positions, that they just let it go and said, let's not go there. So we have the data that women showed that they were capable, but not allowed. And you'll see this theme really through our history is sort of the two angles of the discussion and the debate, which is whether women could serve in certain roles and whether women should serve in certain roles. Okay, so as you think about it yourself or what you've read about it, try and at least categorize stuff into one of those two things. Is this a capability issue, or is this a policy issue as far as what proper roles are for men and women kind of stuff? And so you'll see that evolve over time in our history. So, World War II, after World War II, massive demobilization of our forces, but a real significant law was passed in 1948, the Armed Forces Integration Act, which was really set the stage for women's full integration into the military. And the intent was to create the legal backdrop so that if we ever needed to mobilize like we did again in World War II, we would at least have the mechanisms there to be able to mobilize, both men and women. There were limitations, though, because now we're demobilizing to peacetime. So, women could only be like 2% of the force, and women could only hold the rank of lieutenant colonel permanently. So there were specific limits about, how women can serve in the Armed Forces Integration Act. That's the act that, when it went on the books, banned women from flying combat aircraft, okay? That's also the act that banned women from being on combat ships. Interestingly, there was no ban of women serving in ground combat in this act, okay? So we banned combat aircraft, we banned combat ships, and we didn't ban ground combat. The intent at the time was never that women would be in ground combat, but the issue was it was too difficult to define, legally define where does ground combat start and where does it end. And so instead of trying to write that in law, they said, hey, Army, figure it out. Department of Defense, figure it out. The intent is, women are in combat, but we'll specifically say not on combat ships, and we'll specifically say not on combat aircraft. In fact, and let me correct myself, women actually were banned from serving on all ships because of that law, which is very interesting. I'll read a quote because, when you look into this, that did not come from an incredible study that was done to say women don't belong serving on ships or women can't serve on ships or anything like that. It was they'd gotten to the point where they're wrapping up this legislation. There was a hearing going on. Representative Carl Vinson at the time is in a dialogue now with a guy in the DOD, and he just sort of spurts out at the end of this hearing, I'm just throwing it out for what it's worth. These are my views, and I think this will strengthen the bill to have it positively understood by Congress that ships are not a place to which women are going to be detailed, and nobody has authority to detail them on ships. Of course, they're not going to be detailed to serve on ships, but you can never tell what's going to happen. Somebody might say, they need a few of them up there to do communications or some other kind of work, and I don't think a ship is a proper place for them to serve. Let them serve on shore or in the continental United States or outside the United States, but keep them off the ships. Of course, they ought to be on hospital ships, actually. So he's just thinking out loud, here in front of everybody. And then, but I would not want to restrict the prohibition to just combatant vessels. Okay, put down, quote, serve in sea duty, unquote. You have auxiliary ships as well as combat ships. Just fix it so they can't go to sea at all. So this is essentially what led to, a several decade, prohibition of having women, serve on Navy ships, which is extraordinary. The whim of one congressman just thinking out loud ends up being in the law. So, for those of you who are studying the legislative process, that's probably troubling to you, but we were talking about that last night. That still happens today. That was my personal opinion again. Okay, so now we fast forward to the 50s, 60s, 50s and 60s into the 70s, and I know I got to hurry, so I'll go fast here. At the time, you got to think back again. culturally what we had going on. I mean, we very much were in a traditional, women were in a very traditional role in society in that time frame. And so even though women were in uniform, even though women had shown in World War II, they were in extraordinary conditions, they were alongside, the men in both theaters, they were, some of them were dying, some of them were getting wounded. By the way, 86 women, I forgot to mention this, were prisoners of war in World War II as well, which is a little known fact. When we discuss, women can't be POWs. Well, women were POWs back in World War II. So now we get to the 50s and 60s, and for the women who were serving in that time, who I've talked to many of them, it was a very frustrating time because it became, not so much like, what do you bring to the fight, but it was like, how do you look in your pantyhose? And no, I mean, I'm not kidding. And it was very much, physical attributes were really important. They had all the women, pose for different pictures before they were allowed to be chosen to enlist or to be, become an officer. They were trained in how to put on makeup and how to maintain a feminine appearance. And I mean, it was, I know you guys are laughing, and many of them, they talk about, no kidding, how they are over serving in Korea or Vietnam, as nurses. They are in, they are in the muck and the mud. They've been on their feet for 72 hours. There's shells flying overhead. I mean, combat is dirty and ugly and rotten, and there was messages coming from Washington saying, make sure you're still wearing your skirts, and your pumps, to work, because it's important to maintain a feminine image. And the women and the men who were out in the field were like, what is going on? So it was a very interesting time of trying to sort out what women should be doing. And a lot of women who even served in World War II were very frustrated by this. Some who deployed over to the European or the Pacific Theater in World War II for other jobs besides medical were frustrated because they'd signed up to go deploy for Korea, Vietnam, and they were denied. Unless you were a nurse and it was absolutely necessary, they couldn't deploy. There was a great deal of frustration. One Air Force Master Sergeant that I've got a quote from said, when she was denied, she said, I served in North Africa and Italy. I can sure as hell serve in Vietnam, was her frustration. Like, what is going on here? Another quote by retired Brigadier General Pat Foote. You guys may have heard of her. She's an Army retired general, and she conveys her experiences in Vietnam, which is just incredible. She says, when I was in Vietnam in 1967, I was not weapons qualified. In fact, we were not even allowed to carry a weapon. I was up along the Cambodian border once with a field artillery battalion. The only thing I could do was run around carrying my purse. I called it my M16 purse, she says. She says, I was wearing a baseball cap, no helmet, no flak jacket, no weapons, nothing. I was a liability to that unit. Women in the Army don't want to be liabilities. They want to be assets, partners in defense with their male counterparts. So, now you have a dynamic going on where you do have women that were, who did deploy, and they are a liability. And so this sort of adds to the emotional, women don't belong here. Well, they don't belong there because they've not been equipped and trained to be able to, be a part of the unit, and they are a liability. And so, we do, as we sort out this debate and this discussion sort of objectively, we got to, make sure we've got some good data and we get rid of that emotion and go, is this an issue of lack of training, or is this an issue of putting people in a position where they were going to fail? And that is clearly the case that was going on back then. So, now I'll run through real quick. In the 70s, a lot of things changed. Incrementally, more and more positions were being open for women to serve. ROTC was open to women. The academies were all open to women in 76. Pilot training was open to women in 1976 for the first time since the WASPs. Women started to attend pilot training again. But we tried to draw a line. We tried so hard to draw a line between combat and non-combat. So on the air side, they decided women can be in non-combat aircraft, so they can fly C-130s. Eventually, they could fly U-2 spy planes, which had been, shot down in other situations. They can fly essentially unarmed aircraft. Helicopters, medevac helicopters that will go deep into enemy territory to pick up a medevac. But the emotional dynamic was essentially what we used to joke about as women officers and pilots was, we can get shot at, but we can't shoot back. That was really where the line was drawn. We were at risk. They tried to minimize the risk, but we were at risk in enemy territory, at risk of dying, at risk of being shot down. But the thought of having a woman at the helm of an A-10, it was like, we just couldn't, we didn't want to go there. So we draw the line and say women can be in non-combat, but they can't be in combat. Similarly, we came up with actually I'll get to that in a minute. In that same time frame, in 1978, a group of Navy women filed a class action suit. I was not the first woman to file a lawsuit against the government. So a group of Navy women filed a class action suit against the government saying, why can't we serve on Navy ships? You know, they were the communications, you know, officers that Carl Vinson was so afraid of. You know, they were doing their job, but they were restricted from being able to fully do their job because they could never go out onto the ships, which is, I mean, the Navy is about ships. And so it was actually causing great frustration and inefficiency in the Navy. So a bunch of them filed this class action lawsuit saying you need to open up ships to women to serve on, and they won. And I'll tell you, the opinion in the case by Judge John Sirica is one that is still fundamental to go back and look at today, and I do, you know, because the arguments that were made to overturn and say this policy is not reasonable one, or this law is not a reasonable one. And I'm not using legal language. I apologize to all you guys. I'm just a fighter pilot, not a lawyer. But the bottom line, you know, one of the quotes that he says in his opinion is, because of this section 6015, which is the Carl Vinson Memorial Law there, because of the section 6015, sex required to take precedence over individual ability, where the essential part of the naval service is concerned. Significantly, none of the limitations and disadvantages facing Navy women is traceable to any studied evaluation made of male and female capabilities that reveals that women lack the native ability to perform competently in positions that were held exclusively by men. So his opinion said, change the law, and Congress then put in an amendment to the Defense Authorization Act that next year that opened up every ship but combat ships to women. So now, you know, we've evolved just a little bit further, so now women can be on all the support and auxiliary ships, but they can't be on combat ships, okay? And this is in 1978. At the same time, the Army was told, come up with a definition of combat, you know, again, which they couldn't do back in 1948. So there's like, figure it out. So they do another study, you know, when in doubt, do a study, right? So they do a study, and they decide that, okay, what we're going to do is define combat as, quote, engaging the enemy with individual or crew weapons while being exposed to direct fire, a high probability of direct physical contact with enemy personnel, and a substantial risk of capture. Direct combat takes place while closing with the enemy by fire, maneuver, and shock effect to destroy or capture him while repelling his assault fire by fire, close combat, or counterattack, okay? So they say this is the definition of combat, and then they went through and they looked at every single job in the Army, and they coded it. P1 to P7. P1 is, no kidding, this is an infantry, this is a direct combat job. P7 is, you know, somebody back home is never going to deploy, and, you know, the least risk of going into combat. So every single position was coded, P1, P2, and women couldn't be in P1, even though a lot of times they waived that, and women were actually in some P1 positions. And to this day, this coding actually stands, that every job is that a P1? Women can't be in it. Is that a P2? You know, maybe we can have a waiver. So this is a very bureaucratic sort of administrative way to try and deal with a very difficult issue, which is where do you draw the line? Where is combat? Where's not combat, all right? We then came up with a rule called the risk rule in 1988. So we come up with the new rules. They're trying to sort this out because they realize, okay, wait a minute, someone could be in a combat support job, but because they're given logistics to an infantry unit, they could be right up there with them. So how do we sort that out? I mean, it's a combat support job. You're a cook, you know, but you actually have a high risk of capture and a high risk of being, you know, shot by the enemy, killed, wounded, whatever. So they came up with this risk rule. The DoD risk rule was essentially, let's look at all non-combat jobs, and if it looks like there's a really high risk that you might be, you know, caught in the crossfire or potential POW, then women couldn't be in those jobs either, right? So that actually created another administrative layer of trying to figure out, you know, back in an office who, you know, where combat starts and where it finishes. It was a very lofty attempt, but, you know, that doesn't usually survive first contact with the enemy. So now we fast forward to, you know, Just Cause. In Panama, we had 770 women deployed to Just Cause. Some of them were military police commanders, you know, platoon commanders. Some of them were helicopter pilots, you know, going right into the combat zone, earning air medals for combat. But, you know, women are not in combat, you know, is what our stance was. So that first caused the first data point of, you know, even to the American public, are women in combat or are they not in combat? You know, what is the deal here? Desert Storm was the next watershed. 40,000 women deployed to the theater for Desert Storm. And, you know, you guys saw that on TV. Again, it was, you know, 2 women were captured as POWs, 13 women were killed. Women were right out there, charging in, with the troops into Kuwait in their combat support jobs, where the risk rule said they were not likely to get hurt, but the enemy didn't get that memo, so it didn't comply with that. So I mean, the reality was that the performance and the realities of the combat of Desert Storm, which, by the way, was a lot more conventional and traditional compared to what we're fighting today, caused the next level of discussion and debate that changed laws and policies, that are still in place today. So after Desert Storm, Congress, took a look at, okay, what are we doing here? Women can't do what again, and why? And so very quickly after Desert Storm, first Congress repealed, in 1991, first Congress repealed the combat aircraft restriction, so it was no longer against a law for women to fly fighters and bombers. Shortly thereafter, they repealed the combat ships restriction, and as DOD then sorted it out, they eventually opened up combat ships and combat aircraft to women. They rescinded the risk rule and said it doesn't matter anymore, the risk rule is too hard to enforce. And so that opened up, I mean, no kidding, over 80,000 jobs, to women because of these changes that went on. It was pretty significant. Not that, 80,000 women were going to go fill them, but it was just positions that were now open to whoever was qualified and capable. And that is really the reality of where we are today. There is no law in the books that says that women can't be in any position anywhere in the military serving anywhere. It is a Department of Defense policy that stems back to the mid-90s that now just says, hey, women cannot be in direct ground combat as defined by this P1 through P7 thing. And they also cannot be in units that, just another element to that is they can't be in units that are routinely co-locate with fighting units, which again, that's very, very difficult to figure out. So now we fast forward to Iraqi freedom and enduring freedom. The commanders in the field are the ones that have to deal with this headache more than anybody else. I mean, they have, because these are all just assignment policies. You're put in a job in a position based on a base back home, and you're told, hey, this is a job that's, not likely to co-locate with combat units. And guess what? You get the deployment order and war's going on, and we go. So, we get to, you guys are watching it all on TV. Next thing you know, you got Jessica Lynch and a couple other people, lost in transportation company out in the middle of nowhere in firefights, people dying, a couple of, young women, getting taken as POWs. And that sort of, again, people are like, how did that happen? Well, they were in a unit that doesn't routinely co-locate with, the enemy, with the combat units, which again, it seemed like they were pretty much co-locating with them as they were driving towards Baghdad in their transportation company to support the combat operation. So, this definitely caused another, the data we have for Operation Iraqi Freedom and Enduring Freedom has certainly brought another discussion, that's gone on. On the one side, you have people that are very emotional about whether women should or could, serve in whatever role, to include, fighter pilots, saying, women don't belong here, women don't belong in combat, women don't belong getting shot at, they don't belong at risk of being a POW. But the reality of the current war that we're fighting right now is, you guys have seen it. I mean, contractors, civilians, reporters, and people in military uniform in combat and combat support, they are all at risk. It's a 360-degree battle going on. I mean, the enemy is everywhere, and anybody is at risk of being killed, captured, taken POW, and in a firefight with the enemy. So we are at a similar place when it comes to the ground combat rule, from my view, where we are still trying to hold on to women can be in defensive firefights. It's okay for them to be manning checkpoints where somebody may come up with as a suicide, bomber, or they're manning a convoy, no kidding, on the 50 cal, on a convoy protecting it, and if they get ambushed, by God, they're killing the enemy just like the guy next to them. They're helping save their buddies, they're pulling out their M16, and we're okay with that. I mean, as a nation, both men and women have shown great bravery and courage in battle, and we're okay with that, but you can't give the woman an M16 and have her be in a job that is offensive in nature. Their job can't be to actually go, kick down doors and try and rat out the enemy, but it's okay for them to kill the bad guys after they get ambushed, So in my mind, we're still in a similar sort of, let's try and draw the line like we did with the air, that you can't, you can get shot at and you can shoot back, but we don't want your job to be go out and kill the enemy. It's causing a lot of discussion, debate. My view of what I think should happen is we need to unemotionally unemotionally evaluate people when they show up to serve in the military for what they bring to the fight. What are their physical capabilities? What are their mental capabilities? What's their aptitude? And evaluate them and put them in whatever job that they're capable of doing. Right now, a couple of the arguments against women serving in ground combat or being assigned to ground combat, one of them is physical strength. They say, hey, women just don't have the physical strength to be in ground combat. And I agree with you that women in general, I'm not going to debate the fact that women in general have less strength than men if you put the two bell curves right next to each other. But like we've had to do in other areas, if a woman shows up who's physically capable and get through the training and become an Army Ranger, why would you then take the guy who's less qualified, less capable to take her place instead? Let's treat people like individuals. There'll be very few women who can get through some of that training, but why not pick the best person for the job? Why are you excluding 51% of the population for competing? At the same time, a guy shows up to a recruiting station right now in the Army, and they take an aptitude test, they go through medical clearance, they check their eyes, they make sure they don't have any heart issues, they do a full medical thing. And if they want to be an infantry guy, it doesn't matter if they're 100 pounds soaking wet, never fought anyone in their life, they can go to the infantry. And they're not even given a physical test to see if they have the capability to, lift a certain amount of weight or do they don't even give them a separate test to say you're capable to go to the infantry. They just say, okay, you got this medical exam, you got this on your aptitude test, and you're a man, go. And it's not just the infantry that's excluded, you guys. It's 200,000 positions right now in our military to include all sorts of things like, manning a multiple launch rocket system artillery, similar back to World War II. Women can't do that because, again, that's shooting and you can't do that. To just being a crew member and fixing, certain weapons that are, supporting the guys that are on the front lines, or being a combat engineer. People are out there doing reconstruction efforts right now in Afghanistan and Iraq. Women can't fill those positions. So, we're at the place where we've got another paradox going on. Women can now fly, whether you agree or disagree, women can now fly Apache helicopters, deep, into enemy territory, kill the bad guys up close, get shot down, be killed, become a POW and everything that goes with that. And we have decided we're okay with that. But they can't fly a special operations helicopter, an MH-53, to go be a part of a special operations mission. They can man the checkpoints with their weapons or be on a convoy with 50 cal as a security forces troop, and we're okay with that. But they can't be in the special operations force, which needs to use all sorts of capabilities in order to do clandestine operations and interact with the the local populace. They can't be combat engineers. So you kind of go like, where are we at right now? And is it logical still, or is it emotional? And my opinion is that we're, as we've evolved, we're to the point now where we're still going, okay, women have shown that they're capable in combat. 75 women have died in Operation Iraqi Freedom. I know over 3,000 men have, and I know I want to, devalue that. That has been a significant sacrifice. But we should never value a woman's life more than a man's. When any American comes home in a body bag, we should be upset about that. And for those who say that, oh, we just don't want American women coming home in a body bag, do you want an American man coming home in a body bag? And why would you devalue that man's life, by even talking about this as a separate issue? War is difficult. Combat is ugly. Our nation is at war, whether you agree or disagree with where we are. We are. People are over there every day, putting their lives on the line. And so it is, from my view, it is our absolute necessity at this point to get past some of this emotional stuff and to go, let's pick the right people for the job. Let's put them in positions that they're qualified for so we have the most effective fighting force. The Army is struggling with recruiting right now, and they have lowered their standards in order to be able to keep the all-volunteer force going. The number of guys that are entering the Army that do not have high school degrees has increased significantly. The number that have lower scores on the aptitude test have increased significantly. The number that are getting waivers for medical issues or criminal violations or alcohol and drug problems has increased significantly. We're lowering the bar in order to try and fill our requirements, and we just announced that we're increasing our Army Marine forces by 92,000 people. So, it's my view based on my experience that you gotta, everyone who walks in the door, you gotta treat them for what they bring to the fight, and you gotta assign them to the right position. We gotta get past all this other crap, and we gotta move on because this is serious business, and it's not time to be in one direction, either saying women don't belong doing this, or in the other direction, having women in positions they don't belong in because they're not capable and they're not qualified. So I'll wrap that up for now. I do have some other thoughts about how we need to change our ethos a little bit for men and women to truly fight alongside each other that I can do in the Q&A if that'll work. Yeah. Okay, cool.
Okay, we've got 15 minutes or so for questions and answers. She's obviously raised quite a few issues, and so we'll take your questions. And by the way, please stand and speak as loudly as you can. Yes?
I have a question about cohabitation issues on submarines or in the special forces, if that has any bearing on these assignments and how that has changed or how you see that changing in the future.
Okay, good question. Cohabitation issues. In the research that I've recently done, I spent more time talking about the ground combat issue than the submarine issue and the cohabitation issue. And again, there's a couple of key arguments people come up with. They say women shouldn't be doing, in submarines or ground combat. One is they don't have the strength. The second one is they decrease cohesion. And under that cohesion, you've got the whole men and women can't, be close together. You're gonna have sexual misconduct, sexual assault. It's gonna degrade, the warfighting team when you go down that road. So those arguments are out there, and they're in my paper, but I didn't talk about them. My personal opinion is that cohesion issues are issues that are human issues. You put a bunch, I've seen this. I have seen squadrons that have issues cohabitating with a bunch of men. They have nothing to do with sexual issues, but, because they're not a cohesive team, because they have strife between them, because people come from different backgrounds, racial issues, or whatever it is. But it is very difficult. Let's just say we took this whole group right here and said, you guys now are all going to be a team. Your lives are in each other's hands. We're going to put you all in training together, and you got to listen to everything that comes out of the people's mouth who are over you, and you got to follow them, and you need to sacrifice yourself for your teammate, and you need to do it now. And you got all different personalities going on right here. You maybe not even like each other, and you put in a tight group together and say, figure it out. We go through training to try and build that bonding, but putting any human being in that situation is very difficult to do. And I have seen some of the least cohesive units that haven't had any women in them, and they got other issues going on, So, cohesion is a leadership issue, and, again, my experience personally, and 18, 19 years in uniform is, just because you have a woman show up in a unit doesn't mean your cohesion decreases. The whole idea, and I know I'm not talking specifically about cohabitation, I will in a second, the whole idea that, women showing up in a male, traditionally male warfighting unit is going to, destroy male bonding. You guys have heard that, right? Again, I've led a squadron in combat where we, killed a lot of bad guys, we saved a lot of good guys, and we could take a poll of my guys and not just me talking. We had a very cohesive team. Cohesion has nothing to do with gender. Cohesion has to do with a shared vision, a shared passion for what you're doing, and a shared responsibility in that. And when you go take the hill, it doesn't matter what the gender is of the person next to you if you have a cohesive team that is committed to the mission. So those people who say that, and there was a lot of that before women went into fighters, there was a lot of people, a lot of men coming out in the fighter community going, no, the worst possible thing's going to happen. Women are going to be fighter pilots. You're going to destroy everything of our male bonding and cohesion. It's like the sky is falling. And they would interview people and say, well, have you ever worked with a woman before? No. But we know it's going to happen, and there's just a lot of fear. That reality has not panned out, okay? Now we, fast forward to cohabitation. When I deployed over to Kuwait for the first time, we just transitioned women into fighters. We're deploying over, we're going to go fly in Iraq, and guess what? The housing situation on Kuwait base was interesting. They had all the enlisted in a tent city. They had all the officers in some bombed out dorms that, they were pretty ratty. They were bombed out during Desert Storm. And they had all the pilots in some trailers on a different part of the base. So we had pilot town, officer town, and enlisted town. So guess where they wanted to put me? They couldn't figure it out, because the original thing was like, it looks like you might have to go over to the dorms. Well, the reason they have pilot town was so the pilots could be together, A, for bonding, and B, for crew rest. We needed to, we were doing a 24-hour operation, and you needed silence for people to be able to get their rest. So, I just went to the boss and said, look, these guys are like my brothers, we are a team fighting together. There's trailers with, separate little rooms in there, and I just said, I need to live with them. And it's my responsibility to make sure that everybody's okay with that. To include, by the way, this is just my editorial comment, I used to go to the wives' meetings so that, to make sure that the wives in my squadron didn't think I was, somehow, going after their husband or whatever. I mean, there were some fears going on that I needed to allay to just say, look, I am here to do my job and my mission, And we're going to be professional, and we're going to show discretion, and we're going to show privacy, but we got a mission to do, and we just need to, push past all that. And so it's my view that professional people focused on the right thing with the right leadership can get past that. I'm not an idiot to realize that if you throw 218-year-olds together, men and women, that the problem isn't going to be a little bit more significant. I mean, it isn't, But, we tell people, when you go over to the combat zone especially, this is what you need to focus on, and you need to, the mission is the most important thing, and leadership, from my view, is huge to be able to set a climate, that people are not, treating their classmates like, or their squadron mates like they're a piece of meat, that they're treating each other with respect, both on the men and women's side, that they're treating themselves with respect as far as, their behavior, that they realize it's about the mission effectiveness. I know that's pie in the sky a little bit, but dealing with any sort of sexual issues that come up, to me, is no different than dealing with other issues that come up, that, male and male issues that come up that are also affecting the good order and discipline of your unit, which as a commander, you're dealing with those things all the time. So for those people who are against women in the military saying, oh, this is going to be so bad, they forget to mention all the other issues you deal with all the time, with a group of, of men in your unit. So I think it can be dealt with. Generally speaking, when the shots aren't being fired and we're back in peacetime, that's more where the issues pop up. When people are in a combat zone and their life is on the line, usually people, you usually sort of get down to the bottom rung of the Pavlov's hierarchy of needs, where it's like, I'm just trying to get through the day, you know what I'm saying? So, all these other issues we just need to get past. Pregnancy, I'll throw out as another issue, because that's a one that people say women can't be in any of these jobs because they're potentially get pregnant. There was a couple cases that got lots of media coverage, Desert Storm, women having to go home because they got pregnant, or women, going off ships because they're pregnant. This is where I'm going to depart from sort of the traditional feminist view, because, I have very strong feelings about, there were lawsuits filed in the past for women to not be automatically discharged from the military because they became pregnant. I mean, there were women who fought to be able to still serve and wear the uniform and not be kicked out because they're pregnant. I think because of the struggle of how we have dealt with integrating women in the past, where women have we've put up a lot of stuff, coming a long way. The pendulum, I think, is now gone in the other direction, where we don't want to go down this line of saying, you can't get pregnant anytime you want if you sign up and give an oath of office to wear the uniform. This is my view, okay? This is not the view of the Department of Defense of the United States Air Force. But I think we need a climate where we can honestly, without legal retribution, stand in front of our units like I did as a commander and say, look, we know we're deploying from September to February. Therefore, men, do not get your wife pregnant as best to your ability so that she's going to have her child in the middle of this deployment, because you're not coming home. I mean, this is 100% preventable, you know what I'm saying? So, I mean, I'm not saying whatever, you don't want to go down that road. But anyway, but my point was, don't be irresponsible, that you need to do the best you can to say, I'm going to, men, don't get your wife pregnant. Women, don't get pregnant. Now, if you do everything in your possibility, to avoid that, and something happens, I do not want to be encouraging our young women to have abortions or to be endangering the life of a fetus. You got to watch that climate so you're not going in that direction where somebody, accidents happen. But in my view, and I know this is a little crazy, but those should be treated as accidents happen. Okay, just like you went out skiing last weekend and you broke your leg and now you can't go on the deployment. You didn't plan it, but it happened, and we're going to deal with it, and we're going to deal with it professionally. My view is we have some people, and it's especially the young enlisted right now, because we're not talking about this stuff, that just, either they're not being responsible in their, sexual activity, or they think, well, I can have a baby whenever I want, and there's a few, but I'll tell you, it permeates to everywhere, and it permeates to people's attitudes about all of us who say, oh, we're coming up on a deployment and I don't want to go, I'm going to get pregnant. And it's that sort of, you can't legislate that, you can't punish it, and it's very few people. I mean, I'll tell you, it's very, very few people, but it's enough to piss everybody off, and it's enough to, excuse my language, but it's enough to cause a problem so that when I walk into my unit, they'll look at every woman and go, oh, are you going to be there and be reliable when we deploy, or are you not? So we all get lumped into this, problem. We also, on a case-by-case basis, allow women to get out of their commitment to the military if they become pregnant, which I think is just ludicrous. I mean, pregnancy is a temporary condition and parenthood is a permanent one. So, we've got people who, men and women who we need to work with to make sure they have people to take care of their children, especially single parents, when they're called to deploy. But, go back to the 70s where women were being kicked out and now fighting to be able to stay in. And now here we are in 2007 and we're still allowing women on a case-by-case basis. Many times it's denied. To get out of their military commitment because they're pregnant. We got to get past this stuff. I mean, from my view, some of these issues we're talking about now, they're holdovers to the 50s and 60s sort of wear the pantyhose and, get your lipstick and your M16 purse. And we got to, if we're going to go forward and take this seriously to treat people as individuals and have the most capable fighting force, we got to get rid of some of this other baggage, and stop, tiptoeing around some of these issues that are really affecting readiness. When women were less than 10% of the force and we had a Cold War force and we had a whole lot of people and we weren't deploying a lot, you could have some of these things happening, but we don't have time or extra slot for that right now. I mean, everybody needs to be a part of the fight. We're not IBM. Our job is defending the nation. It's a serious business, and you do lose some of your rights when you join the military. And we can't legislate that, but we can certainly have an attitude to make sure that we are inculcating people with a culture of we treat each other with equal respect, we treat each other as teammates whose lives are in each other's hands, we're not sexual objects to each other, and we're certainly not going to get out of our commitments and use some sort of double standard in order to find a loophole to get out of your service. Go work at Walmart if you want to do that. Nothing against Walmart, but
Okay.
that was a long answer to a short question, but
We have another question. Yes, sir. You're speaking loud enough, sir.
I'll just say, my niece graduated from law school about 15 years ago, so it's the first time I've been back here since I was in a mock trial with it, and Professor Robertson was one of the professors, but I'm enjoying your talk. I don't agree with all of it, but because I was combat infantryman in Vietnam, and I think that was a different period. The military is much more mechanical, more equipment. So I think women can be added in the slots, like you say, but I'm sort of still opposed to it, but I think the practicality is that they can fit in. But I personally hope it's kept to a minimum because it's very stressful. My friends here from the military on the Purple Heart are here with me. Al Myers was a POW in World War II, and Jesse Torres, a Marine. But and really enjoying your talk. But I'll tell you a situation I heard. I have a friend who was a Marine officer serving attached to an Army unit in Iraq. He said because of the combat limitations, they couldn't patrol because the women couldn't patrol. So the men objected to patrolling because they were short-handed because of the number of women.
Right.
So they didn't patrol. So they were getting injured because they weren't patrolling enough. In the Marines' point of view, so he resigned.
Right.
And that's a problem I see with the rule.
No, it causes, again, the commanders in the field have to deal with it, and it's very, it's a very complicated thing in this war we're fighting right now. I mean, I still personally believe any man or woman who's, especially going to be in the infantry needs to be able to, technical all day long. We got hand-to-hand fighting going on right now, and you better be able to close in and kill the enemy. And so, that's a very serious thing. There's a lot of people argue, oh, women can do more of this because it's, it's more of a video. It's not, look at the war we're fighting right now. This is very close in. You need to have courage. You need to have physical strength. You need to be able to carry your buddy off the battlefield. And there's going to be very few women that are capable and qualified and desire to do that. But if they are, then I believe, they should be able to serve in that capacity. It's war is hell. War is an ugly, ugly, ugly thing, and I wouldn't want our men or our women, having to deal with that. Yeah. Yeah.
Another question in the back.
Thanks for your
Yes.
service.
Thanks for your talk. It was really interesting. I'm wondering about the draft. I'm a historian, and one of the things I think about is the debate over the ERA in the 80s, and how that was largely defeated because of the fear that women would be drafted.
Right.
But it seems like the logic would lead us to the fact that if there were a draft, that women and men should serve equally in this day and age. I wonder what your thoughts would be about that.
Yeah, my opinion on it is certainly not a majority opinion, but Rosker versus Goldberg was a case brought to the Supreme Court saying, it's not fair that men only are being drafted. Why isn't it open to women? The ERA, as you know, there was a big debate over this, emotional, oh my gosh, we don't want our daughters and our mothers being drafted. The ruling in Rosker versus Goldberg was essentially because the DOD continued to, they were deferring to the legislative branch, and you can help me out here, Ryan, if I'm dorking this up, but anyway, deferring to the legislative branch who said, hey, the primary, even though it's not stated in the Selective Service Act, the primary role of the draft would be to get ground troops, and since women are not allowed to be in ground combat, therefore we'll defer to the legislation to continue to allow them to be banned. Obviously, if we just assign people based on their capabilities and we get rid of the DOD, the DOD policy restricting women from serving in ground combat jobs, then that would be open for another challenge, I think. It wouldn't automatically open up the draft to women, but it would be open for another challenge to say, why can't women be drafted? My personal opinion, and I can give you the name of a book out there that's really good that talks about women in the military, civic duty or military liability by Lori Fenner, and there's a debate of both sides of that. My personal opinion is, it is our obligation, it's a fundamental obligation of citizenship to defend the nation. It's a fundamental obligation. I mean, you look at even, one of the arguments for African Americans, getting the right to vote after the Civil War is they fought. They paid with blood, and so now they get the full rights of a citizen because they fought. I mean, I personally believe if we get to the point where we ever needed to institute the draft again, we would be using it to pull, we've talked about using the draft for doctors even in the last 5 years because we needed more medical people, So the draft is more about, hey, we need people to step up and serve, and we need to look at what their capabilities are, what they bring to the fight, and assign them where they belong. So, someone who comes and doesn't have the capability to serve in a ground combat job, man or woman, certainly, wouldn't be sent into that job. So I personally believe that we should amend the Selective Service Act to say all men and women need to register at age 18. Many men will tell you it's the one time they feel they're mostly with a citizen, is to go that day and say, I hope it never happens, I hope we're never in this, position, but by God, I'm registering because this is the law, and if I'm called, I'll serve where I need to serve. The majority of the jobs in the military are not frontline combat jobs. The majority of them are support jobs. So if we're going to mobilize our nation to bring the capabilities, both intellectual, leadership, and physical, in some sort of national emergency beyond what we're experiencing now, then we would need to mobilize everybody, from my view. There's a lot of things that women would bring to the fight in many fields that we serve in across all the services that would be beneficial. So not a popular opinion, I know.
All right, Neelan, last question.
What was it like for you to serve the DOD while being a successful officer and to remain one? I imagine you're limited in answering that.
Yeah, we got 2 minutes to answer that question. It took me an hour and a half last night at dinner to explain all that, but I was joking with a friend of mine, over Easter. It's like I've been actually crucified and resurrected more times than Christ, I think. But all kidding aside, that was a very, 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 very difficult decision that I made. Again, it's a very long story. It was, over 6 years into trying to get the policy changed internally, quietly. I made a choice. My oath of office is to the Constitution of the United States. My oath of office is not to, military policies that I believe are unconstitutional. It is my job as an officer, to sort that out. And that's not an easy thing. And most people go through their career and they never come to a point where they believe that an order is unlawful or unconstitutional. I came to that point. I abided by the policy, by the way. If you Google me, you'll have stories that say I didn't, that I refused to wear the abaya. I abided by the policy, and I used the other branches of government to try and get it changed. I was told very clearly at the time that my career was over by many, many people in a lot of different formats. And I was ready to transition on out of the military and go serve the public in some other capacity at that time. I mean, it was one of those, sort of life decisions to say, okay, I never expected it to come to this, but my oath of office is more important than my career progression, so I'm going to put it on the line here. I felt like I was in a unique opportunity because, as a professor will tell you, fighter pilots run the Air Force, combat capability are the people that are at the table that are listening to. I was given opportunity to become a fighter pilot. I was given opportunity to be promoted early, and I had responsibilities that came with that to make sure that we were not demeaning some of our troops and degrading the good order and discipline of the unit. I mean, when you take a unit and say you're all one together, but then you go off base and you have your guys in polo shirts and jeans and you have your women wearing a burqa, that there are issues that permeate much deeper than what the clothing you have on that actually diminish our warfighting capability. So I was on my way out of the Air Force, and I worked for some leaders who believed in my capabilities and my potential, and I was resurrected the first time, so I was given an opportunity to stay in. And now I've been promoted to colonel, but you know what? The battle's still raging, I'll be honest with you. I mean, I know there's a lot of people out there above me that don't agree with what I did. They are not real happy with me as an officer, but I'm not in a popularity contest. I'm here to defend, my country and support my oath. So at some point, it might be time, to press on and go serve somewhere else. But it made a lot of people mad. I thought my career was over. I'm grateful that I'm still able to serve. I'm grateful I had the opportunity to become a squadron commander after that. I'm grateful I was promoted to colonel after that. I honestly didn't think it was going to happen. I wasn't angry about it. I just thought a lot of times we look back and maybe 20, 30 years later, or when you're dead, they'll go, that person was right, actually. But, usually it's too late, because you pay the short-term price. You know what I'm talking about? So, I mean, I'm grateful to continue to serve, but I'm also aware that, I'm in a minefield as well. But I just continue to focus on the mission and do my job.
Colonel, let me, on behalf of the entirety of Duke Law School and all the sponsoring organizations, really express our appreciation for your being here today. I know that they probably want you back at War College, and they wonder why you're being asked to speak at law schools. But we appreciate your candor, and I think most of the people know in this room that when you talk about military leadership, a large part of that is moral courage. And I think you've demonstrated that throughout your career, and I think you've expressed it well here today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.